All right, welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. You ready to get into it today?
Absolutely. Always ready to dive in.
Okay, perfect. So today we're going international.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, a case that starts in this tiny little English village of Cottenham, but the investigation quickly spans multiple countries.
Wow, okay. I'm intrigued already.
So we're talking child exploitation, the dark web, and the digital trail that led to justice.
That's some heavy stuff right there.
Yeah, it is. Really disturbing, to say the least.
Yeah.
And what gets me is the sheer scale of this whole thing.
Right, it's not just some isolated incident, is it?
No, not at all. We're
Really?
talking hundreds of indecent images. And like I said, the investigation goes global. It's a big one.
Yeah, and that's what always strikes me about these cases. The scale, the interconnectedness of it all. It really shows how the internet, even its darkest corners, can connect people in ways we never imagined.
Absolutely, and that's what we're going to explore today. So this case centers around Carl Robinson and Sophie Edge.
Okay, I'm familiar with this case.
Yeah, so on the surface, they seem like an ordinary couple living in this quiet village. But they were convicted of sexually assaulting a child under 13.
Right, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Exactly, because during the investigation, the police found hundreds, literally hundreds, of indecent images of children on their devices.
And that discovery, those hundreds of images, it's often a sign of something much bigger. It indicates a pattern of behavior, maybe a whole network or operation that needs to be uncovered.
So walk me through how this all unfolded. It sounds like it started with a tip from the New Zealand police.
That's right. New Zealand authorities were already investigating an online network, a group sharing illegal content, and somehow they followed a digital trail that led them all the way back to Robinson in England.
Okay, so how does that even work? How do you track someone's activity like that across continents?
Well, this is where the idea of a digital footprint becomes crucial.
Right, I've heard that term, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
Yeah, so basically every click, every download, every file you share online, it all leaves a trace, a digital trail, if you will. And in Robinson's case, it was a massive trace.
Hold on, for those of us who aren't exactly tech wizards, break down this digital footprint thing a bit more. What exactly does that mean? Like, what are we talking about here?
Think of it this way. Every time you go on a website, download a file, or even just send an email, your computer or phone is interacting with other servers, right? And those interactions, they leave a record.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So it's like leaving fingerprints, but online.
Exactly. Digital fingerprints. And law enforcement, they have these specialized software programs that can piece together those digital breadcrumbs. They can analyze browsing history, recover deleted files, even trace online communication going back years.
Wow, so it's like having a time machine for internet activity. That's pretty incredible, but also kind of scary, you know?
Absolutely. Technology is a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Mm.
But in this case, it was used to bring Robinson to justice.
So they followed that digital footprint right to his door. What did they find when they actually searched his devices?
Get this. On Robinson's devices alone, they found 537 indecent images of children.
537, that's just horrifying.
And that's just what they could recover. You always have to consider the possibility of deleted files, which are harder to get, but sometimes they can be recovered using specific forensic techniques.
So you got Robinson with hundreds of images. It's already incredibly serious. But what about Edge? Where does she fit into all of this?
Initially, it seemed like her involvement was limited to possession of illegal content, but then the investigation took a major turn. They found a video on one of Robinson's devices, a video of Edge herself abusing a child.
Oh, wow. So her role goes way beyond just possessing these images.
Exactly. This discovery shifted her role from passive possession to the production of new material, a much more serious offense in the eyes of the law. It indicated direct involvement in creating child sexual abuse material.
Yeah, that changes everything.
It does, and it makes the whole case even more disturbing and complex.
Absolutely. So I'm assuming this discovery also had a huge impact on the legal consequences for both of them.
Oh, absolutely. We'll get into the repercussions in just a moment. But first, let's take a quick break. That distinction, moving from possession to production carries much heavier legal consequences. It signifies a direct and active role in the abuse. It shows premeditation and intent. It's chilling.
It is. So with this new information about Edge, what were the legal repercussions for both of them? What kind of sentences are we talking about?
Robinson ended up being sentenced to 9 years in prison, Edge to 4. And once they're released, they'll be under extensive monitoring, including a 20-year sexual harm prevention order. So they're going to be on the authorities' radar for a very long time.
Wow, 9 and 4 years. Those are serious sentences. But for the victims and their families, I can't imagine that feels like enough.
You're right, that's often the case. These crimes leave such deep scars, no amount of prison time can truly undo the harm. And it's not just the immediate victims who suffer, the families, the communities. It ripples outwards.
It's heartbreaking. And reading about this case, I can't help but think about those victims. What kind of support is available for them and their families?
There are organizations, thankfully, that specialize in providing support for victims of child sexual abuse. They offer counseling, therapy, legal advocacy, a whole range of services to help survivors heal and reclaim their lives.
That's so important because focusing solely on punishing the perpetrators doesn't address the long-term needs of the victims.
Yeah.
They need help to heal and move forward.
Exactly. These organizations play a vital role in that healing process. They give victims a voice, validate their experiences, and help them navigate that complex path towards recovery. It's about empowering survivors and breaking the cycle of abuse.
You've mentioned the role of law enforcement in bringing these criminals to justice, but I'm curious, what about the responsibility of technology companies in all of this? They provide the platforms where this kind of content is shared.
That's a tough question. It's a complex issue, and one that's being debated more and more these days. We talk about a digital footprint, but what about the platforms where those footprints are left? What are these companies doing to detect and report this type of activity proactively?
It seems like they have a moral obligation to do something.
Yeah.
They have access to so much data. Shouldn't they be using those resources to protect children?
There's a lot of pressure on these companies to do more, and many of them are investing in sophisticated algorithms and technologies to try and identify and flag harmful content. It's a delicate balance, though.
What do you mean?
Well, on one hand, we want these companies to be proactive in combating child exploitation. But on the other hand, we also have to consider issues of privacy and freedom of speech. We don't want these companies to become overly intrusive or censorious. It's a tricky ethical dilemma.
I see your point. It's definitely not a simple solution. But surely doing nothing isn't an option either.
No, definitely not. The stakes are too high. This is a conversation that needs to happen, and we need to find ways to strike that balance between protecting children and safeguarding our fundamental freedoms.
You're right. It's a heavy topic, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the darkness of it all.
I get it. It's heavy stuff. But it's important to remember that while there's darkness in the world, there are also people fighting tirelessly against it. The investigators who work on these cases, the support organizations, the advocates, they're all working to protect children and bring perpetrators to justice.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel hopeless when faced with such horrific crimes. But it's important to remember that there are people dedicated to making a difference. And it's not just up to them, is it? We all have a role to play.
Exactly.
All right.
Every single one of us. And that brings us to the question of what we as individuals can do to make the internet a safer place for children.
So let's talk about that. What can we as individuals do to help combat this issue? I think it's easy to feel overwhelmed and think, what can one person really do?
I understand. It can feel daunting. But honestly, even small actions can have a ripple effect. The first step is awareness. Educate yourself about the signs of child exploitation. Talk to your kids about online safety, set boundaries, and monitor their internet usage.
You know, it's funny. We're so used to hearing stranger danger warnings in the real world, but we often forget that the same applies online.
Exactly. And it's not just about protecting our own children. It's about being vigilant as a community. If you see something suspicious online, maybe an inappropriate profile or interaction report, don't hesitate to contact the authorities or organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
So reporting something that seems off, that's something anyone can do, right?
Absolutely. We often underestimate the power of individual action.
Yeah.
And remember, technology can be a double-edged sword. We need to use it responsibly to protect children and not enable those who would harm them.
This whole conversation has been a real eye-opener. I think sometimes we forget that behind every image or video, there's a real child who's been deeply affected by this.
That's so important to remember. And it's also important to be mindful of the language we use when talking about these crimes. Terms like child pornography can actually minimize the severity of the abuse.
Oh, I've never thought about it that way.
It's true. Using more accurate terms like child sexual abuse material helps us frame these acts for what they are.
Yeah.
Horrific crimes against children.
Shifting the focus from the content to the harm, that's a powerful change. So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there one key takeaway you want listeners to really remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that child exploitation is a societal problem that demands a collective response. It's not just up to law enforcement or technology companies. We all have a role to play in creating a safer world for children both online and offline.
That's a powerful message. Thank you for joining us today on this incredibly important deep dive. And to all our listeners out there, remember, even small actions can make a difference. Let's work together to protect the most vulnerable members of our society.
Reporting something that seems off, that's something anyone can do.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It feels like such a small thing, but
But it can make a huge difference. We often underestimate the power of individual action. You know, if enough people report suspicious activity, it can really help law enforcement build a case. And remember, technology, it can be a double-edged sword. We need to use it responsibly to protect children, not enable those who would harm them.
I think this whole conversation has been a real eye-opener, for me at least. It's easy to get caught up in the technical details, the investigation, the legal stuff. But sometimes we forget that behind every image or video, there's a real child whose life has been deeply affected by this.
That's a crucial point. And it's also important to be mindful of the language we use when talking about these crimes.
Maybe.
Well, terms like child pornography, for example,
Yeah, right.
they can actually minimize the severity of the abuse.
I never thought about it that way.
It's true. Using more accurate terms like child sexual abuse material, it helps us frame these acts for what they are: horrific crimes against children.
Yeah, it shifts the focus from the content to the harm. It's a powerful change. So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there one key takeaway you want our listeners to really remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that child exploitation is a societal problem,
Mm-hmm.
and it demands a collective response.
Yeah.
It's not just up to law enforcement